In this video, I'm going to show you how to build the macropad macropad from Keyhive. Now, full disclosure, this is not an official build guide. I have no relationship with Keyhive or any of the vendors mentioned in this video. Also, this is not a sponsored video. I bought all these items with my own money. Now, you can build the macropad as a 4x5 macropad, but in this video, I'm going to show you how to build it as a numpad. This is actually one that I built several months ago. So I'm going to show you how to build it from the printed circuit board. You're going to need the following things. We're going to need a soldering iron and some solder. You're going to need a pair of flush cutters. You're going to need some tape. We're going to need some PCB mount stabilizers, 3 of them for a number pad. And we're going to need some switches. We're going to need 17 of them for a number pad, and you're going to want to make sure you get PCB mount switches. Everything else you're going to need to build the macropad, Keyhive will include in the packaging for you. So the first thing we're going to want to do is to put the diodes on the PCB. Now, when you get the kit from Keyhive, it's going to come, the diodes are going to come on a strip like this. In the interest of time, I've gone ahead and pre-bent and pre-cut all the diodes that we're going to need for this build. But let me go ahead and show you how I build these, or how I bent them. Let me go ahead and cut one out. Now, the holes that the diode needs to fit into are 0.3 inches across. Now, you can get a bending jig like this, but unfortunately this particular one, is the smallest it goes to is 0.4 inches, so it's too big. It's not going to work. If you might be able to find one that you can 3D print, or maybe you can find another jig, or maybe you can build one. But there's some other things you can do. You can, if you have a pair of needle nose pliers, you can put the needle nose pliers on the wire right next to the glass body. It's important that you get the glass body protected from the bend. You want to make sure that those pliers are between where you're going to bend the wire and the glass body. Otherwise, you might break the glass, and that's not good. I happen to know that if I use these, the spacing would be just over 0.3 inches, so that's not going to work for me either. Through trial and error, I found that what works the best are the leads on my multimeter. And what I do is I take the wire and put the diode right on to the next to the wire. These have a little notch in them, so I put the wire in that little notch, and I can bend the diode leg over and turn it over and bend the other side. And straighten up our wires, and that is a perfect bend. So that should be able to go right into our PCB. There we go, just like that. So now I just need to put in 19 more. So let's go ahead and do those. You can see why I cut these ahead of time. It would take a lot longer on the video if I was to cut and bend all these diodes on camera. So we're just going to put them in like this, or to pre-cut. Now, diodes are a directional component. It matters which way you put them in. Resistors, which this doesn't use, but resistors, it doesn't matter which way you put those in. They could be put in backwards, and they would work just fine. Diodes, however, they are directional. Diodes allow current to flow in one direction, and it restricts the current from flowing in the other direction. So it does matter which way you put them in. Now, diodes have 2 leads on them. One is called the anode, and the other one is called the cathode. The cathode is marked with a black stripe on this particular diode. And for the macpad, the black stripe goes to the right. By the way, you can tell which way is up if you look at the other macpad. The microprocessor is in the upper left-hand corner of the board. So we're going to put all these diodes in, and then we'll get to soldering them. And as we put them in, we're going to just double check, make sure all of the stripes are on the right hand side. Some of my diodes are a little crooked, I can see, but we'll fix those before we solder them. They'll be fine. There we go. There's all 20 diodes. Now some of them are sitting up a little proud, so we're just going to just smush them down. Make sure they're all flush with the circuit board. Move that out of the way. And let me just double check. Okay. Now, if I was to flip this circuit board over, most of the diodes would probably stay on the circuit board. But a bunch will probably fall out. So I'm going to take the bottom plate, which they give you as part of the kit. I'm just going to put that on top here. That just holds the diodes in place while I flip it over so we don't lose any of our diodes. Okay. Now we're going to take our soldering iron and knock off any of the solder on there. Clean it in their little stuff. Pull off some solder. And let's get the soldering. So we're going to go ahead and tin our tip. And solder. Now when you solder, you want to not use too much solder, and you want to apply it in the proper technique. So if you notice, I touched the soldering iron to the point, the solder point, for about a second, a little less. That will preheat the joint. And then I touch the solder to the joint. I'm not touching the solder to the iron, touching it to the joint. If the joint is hot enough, the solder should flow onto the joint. And I leave my soldering iron there for another second to complete the joint. Again, you don't want to use too much solder. You want to use just enough. It should look like a little volcano when you're done. After I clean my tip, you notice I put some solder on there. That is tinning the tip. I just want to get a little bit of solder in there. And what that does, that acts as a heat bridge, so that when I put the soldering iron on the joint, it can heat the joint. Alright, so I got one side soldered. I don't want to solder both sides at once because I don't want to overheat the component. So now I'm just going to flip it over and I'm going to look and make sure that my components are still flat. Yep, they feel flat. And I'm going to inspect my joints, make sure that they're all good and they look good. I forgot to bring my loop with me, but that's okay. They look pretty good. You have enough light here, I can see fine. All right, so now let's solder the other side of the components. Okay, we're going to tin our tip. Just Just put a little solder in there. And again, we're just going to hold it on there for a second, put some solder on, and lift it up. All right, we don't want to do too much. Let me reposition it so the solder points are on the right-hand side here. You want to keep your soldering iron clean. You don't want to get some stuff on the soldering iron. You know, it is hot, so it'll oxidize anything that's on there. And oxidation will cause the soldering iron to, or the solder to be a little harder to solder. You'll have some bad joints if you do that. There we go. You also don't want to use a lot of pressure when you're soldering. I'm not smashing down on the joint. I'm just touching the soldering iron to the joint. You want about the same amount of pressure that you would have if you put a pencil, lead facing down, on a piece of paper. That's about how much pressure you want. You don't want a lot of pressure. There we go. We're almost done with our diodes. One more. There we go. That's all of our diodes soldered. I'm just going to do a quick inspection of the joints. They look good. All right, now we're going to take our flush cutters and we're going to trim off all of the excess wire. By the way, you don't want to speed up the cooling of the solder once you've soldered the joint. You know, some people like to blow on it. That's not a good idea. Just want to let the solder cool by itself. And we're just snipping the wire right at the top of the soldered joint. Serve it down. That was a little high. There we go. That's half of them. So when you solder, you want to use I follow the 3-second rule. So 1 second to preheat the joint, 1 second to actually solder the joint, and leave the soldering iron for 1 more second after you've soldered. So 3 seconds. Okay, there we go. So these are done. Go ahead and move this out of the way. There we go. That didn't help. There we go. All right, next thing we want to do is put on our microcontroller. Here's it right here. This is the Pro Micro. Now, the leads can go either way. I think you're supposed to solder them like this, but then the leads stick out too far. What I find works a little better is if I insert the leads, a long lead facing down, short lead facing up. The reason I do that is because the the microprocessor is going to be exposed, and so I want everything to look as good as it can. Now I can trim the wires later, but then some of them might be a little different size than others, a little different length. So I just want things to look pretty good. So I put the long side facing down like that. This is where our tape comes in, by the way. Also note that the Pro Micro is face up, so you want to see all the components sticking up on there. And this is where our tape comes in. So we take some tape and we tape down the Pro Micro to the board. I guess we could tape it this way. This just makes sure that it doesn't fall off. Make sure it keeps in position. Now, I'm not going to solder the Pro Micro to the pins just yet. What I'm going to do is I'm going to solder the pins to the board. So this holds the everything nice and flush to the board, allowing me to see the bottom of the board. There we go, just like that. There we go, put that on there, shim it. Okay, let's go ahead and solder the pins to the microcontroller to the PCB. Now what I like to do is I just do the corners first. And that helps me make sure that everything is right. So it actually looks like I've moved it a little bit. And by taping the microprocessor to the pins, make sure that the pins are nicely arranged and everything's all aligned so that when I'm done, I can put the microprocessor back on there. Looks like my pins on the right hand side are a little crooked, but not much. You have to actually know to look at it. Don't want to bother fixing that. No, I think we can just go along with it. It looks fine. Okay. All right, so now I can go ahead and finish soldering the rest of the pins. There we go. Now you can use any soldering iron you want. I happen to be using this old Weller WP25. It's a 25 watt soldering iron. I bought it, oh, I don't know, 15 years ago maybe. It served me fine. Prior to that I used a Radio Shack soldering iron, so you can use whatever you want, whatever works for you. It's great. Get that tape out of my way. You don't need a big professional soldering iron to make a little macro pad. I've seen a product out there called the Pine-Sil, which is a USB powered soldering iron. I have not tried that, but I'm sure that would be just fine. They probably solder things just perfectly well. And check all my soldering points. They look good. All right, let's do the other side. Yeah, this soldering iron has served me well over the past 15 years, however long I've had it. Now I'm skipping every other pin here. I just kind of got used to doing that soldering microcontrollers. I don't want to overheat the board. For pins, probably not that important. But, you know, it became a habit. All right, one more. There we go. Let's take a look at it. They look good. Okay, now we can go ahead and solder the microprocessor onto the board. Again, we're going to put the components face up. There's the other macro pad for comparison. So let's go ahead and solder this one on. Throw that away. Again, we got to clean our soldering iron. And again, I just like to do the opposite corners first. That way I can double check and make sure everything is sitting flush, everything's flat, nothing's sticking up. And that looks good. So let's go ahead and do the rest of them. Need some more solder. You can see that as I'm soldering, as I finish my solder joint, I wipe the end of the soldering iron across the top of the joint. And that's just to make sure I got a nice looking joint. Now, what you can do, I've seen people do this, and I've done this actually in some other keyboards that I've built. You can use Mil-Max sockets, and Mil-Max pins. They look like this actually, just it's like little pieces of wire really, and you can use those to socket your microprocessor. That way, in case if your microprocessor dies or if the board gets damaged, let's say your USB connector gets damaged, you can yank it off the board and put a new one on there. Or maybe you want to upgrade from a Pro Micro, which has a micro USB, and you want to upgrade to an Elite C for USB-C connection. If it's socketed, you can do that. If it's soldered on the board like this is, well, you're out of luck. Alright, one last joint, and then we'll just double check all of our joints, make sure everything looks good. It looks good to me. We'll test it later to find out. Now, this does have some flux on here. Flux is what's inside the solder, and it helps clean the joint as you're soldering, gives you a good soldering joint. What you can do is take some alcohol like this, and I like to use a toothbrush. And just get the toothbrush wet with some alcohol and just brush the flux away. And then really I should follow this up by actually washing it. You can wash it with some soap and water. It's not going to hurt your board. All right, there we go. Now let's go ahead and put our stabilizers on. We need to make sure we put the stabilizers on before we put the switches on because we can't do it in any other order. So the stabilizers are there for the bigger switches. The 0 key, the enter key, and the plus key. Now I bought clip-in stabilizers. I didn't splurge for the screw-in stabilizers. So these just push into the circuit board, just like that. Screw-in stabilizer would have been more stable, but I opted not to do that. You also might want to lubricate and clip your stabilizers. I did that on these. It just takes a little bit of time. That prevents your stabilizers from rattling. Now, is that important on a little macropad like this? I don't know. That's up to you. It's your macropad. You can do whatever you want with it. All right, so all of our stabilizers are in. They're all clipped in. Again, if I had a screw-in stabilizer, they'd be a lot more stable. These are just clipped in, but they'll probably be just fine. Good enough. Okay, now let's go ahead and put our switches in. This is actually why I recommend you use PCB mount switches. This does not have a top plate on it, so there's nothing to hold the switch stable and in place and straight. All it has are these little pins on either side of that center post, those little plastic pins, and they match up into little holes onto the circuit board, and they keep your switch from rotating. They keep it nice and stable. But yeah, you need to have PCB mount stabilizers, or sorry, switches. Well, and stabilizers. The macropad does not support any LEDs for the switches, either PCB mount, like surface mount LEDs or through-hole LEDs. So whatever switches you put in, you're not going to get any backlighting on the LEDs, or sorry, on their switches. Okay, we're almost done. And then we can get to soldering. Why aren't you going in there? That's your home. There you go. And there we go. This all of our switches are in. Just going to give them a little bit of a push. Make sure everything's in nice and stable. Looks like that one wasn't. Okay. And everything's nice and straight and level. Very good. Now, if I was to flip this over to solder, all the switches would fall out. So I'm going to take the bottom plate that came with the project. I'm going to put this on top of the switches, and that just holds them in place while I flip it over. There we go. And I can push it down, make sure everything's seated nice and tight. And let's get a soldering iron and do some soldering. Now what I want to do is I only want to solder one leg on each switch at a time. And that's just so I can verify later or before I do both legs that everything, nothing shifted when I flipped it upside down. You do need to make sure you put enough solder in these holes though. It's a double-sided plate, so it can go through there. Plus the hole is bigger. I think the hole is bigger because I think it supports Alps switches. Alps switches have legs in a slightly different position than the MX style switches. So I have to make them holes a little bigger for them. But that means you can go through a little more solder doing all this. How much solder you're going to need is going to, well, you'll figure that out through experience. You can always add more. Just remember to follow the 3-second rule. You want to preheat for about a second, put the solder on for about a second, and leave the soldering iron on for about a second. I don't think I got these over here. I think I got that one. I didn't get this one. There we go. I think we got them all. We'll just double check our work. Make sure all the solder joints look clean. And they look pretty clean. Now we'll double check, make sure all of our switches are straight. We'd hate to do this and find out one of the switches is out of alignment, like this one is right here. Here we go. So that's why we only do one lead, so we can double check and make sure nothing is out of alignment. So I'll just go ahead and hold it from the back. There we go. And we'll double check and make sure everything is all lined up, and they're all lined up this way. And this way they look good. Very good. We can move that plate out of the way, and let's solder the other side. Pre-tinner soldering iron. Oh, that's one I didn't do earlier. Oh, look at that, I missed one. You always got to go and double check all your work. Make sure everything's been soldered. Otherwise, you might miss one like that, and then that switch doesn't work, and then you start wondering, why isn't my macropad working correctly? I'm just going to double check. Did I miss any of my soldering points? Are any of my soldering points bad? You know, some people will touch the soldering iron to the solder, try and drag solder over to the joint, and that's just not going to make a good joint. That's a cold joint. So we heat the joint, put the solder into the joint, that way we have a good joint. Okay. Did I get them all? Didn't get this one yet. Nor did I get that one. I missed that one. Okay. Let's double check. If you roll it around, you can see the light reflecting off your joint. That tells you if you've got a bad joint or not. You might be able to see something that's missing. Maybe you don't have enough solder on it. Maybe you have too much solder. These all look, all right, these all look pretty good. All right, very good. And that's it. That's all it takes to build a keypad macropad. So I started this channel with just a lock picking video. I had injured my foot. I tore a tendon in my foot a number of months ago, and so I couldn't walk. So I needed to do something to occupy my time while I was healing. I could have just sat and played video games. I decided I wanted to play or wanted to learn the skill, so I learned lock picking, and I posted a video on how to pick a master lock key lockbox. And that thing has gotten about over 1,000 videos or 1,000 views a month, which really surprised me. So out of curiosity, I decided to make a few different videos to see what might be popular. So if you liked this video, or if it was helpful to you, please leave a like. In the future, I'm planning to do maybe some keyboard reviews and maybe a couple of programming tutorials. But if you have any suggestions for videos, please leave a comment. I suppose I should also say please subscribe and ring that bell, but honestly, I really have no idea what that does for me. So thanks for stopping by.